You're watching through the latticed window as a young woman steps into the gilded chamber for the first time, her silk robes trailing behind her like water. She believes this is the beginning of her greatest triumph. She doesn't know that within these marble walls, 280 women will drown in weighted sacks before the year ends. She doesn't know that the golden cage she's entering has consumed more lives than any battlefield. And she doesn't know that the man who will decide her fate has already forgotten the names of the last 12 women he ordered killed. Before we go deeper, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. Every time I see these notifications lighting up from different continents, I'm reminded that certain human stories transcend every border and century. This is Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, nerve center of the Ottoman Empire during its zenith in the 16th and 17th centuries. Behind its fortress walls operated a system so precisely engineered for psychological control that it functioned for over 400 years with barely a modification. The Imperial Harem wasn't simply the Sultan's private quarters. It was a carefully constructed ecosystem of power, terror, and survival, where beauty became currency and love became a fatal liability. The Ottoman archives, preserved today in the Topkapi Palace Museum and the Prime Ministry Ottoman Archives in Istanbul, contain thousands of documents that reveal something historians spent centuries trying to sanitize: systematic institutionalized fear operating at the intersection of absolute power and human intimacy. What makes these records so chilling isn't their incompleteness. It's their meticulous detail. The Ottomans documented everything: purchase receipts for enslaved women, schedules of sexual encounters, execution orders written with the casual precision of grocery lists. They saw nothing shameful in creating paper trails for practices that modern legal frameworks would classify as crimes against humanity. And within those documents lives a truth that challenges our comfortable narratives about history's great empires: that intimacy under absolute power isn't romance. It's weaponized vulnerability dressed in silk. The woman entering that chamber is about to discover what the word harem truly means. In Arabic, it translates to forbidden or sacred. But forbidden to whom? Not to the Sultan, who owned every woman inside as completely as he owned the jewels in his treasury. Forbidden to the women themselves, who would surrender their birth names, their family connections, their capacity for autonomous choice. The very architecture conspired to erase their previous existence. Once those palace gates closed behind them, most would never see daylight unfiltered by marble screens again. They would live, bear children, age, and die without ever standing under an open sky or walking through a city street as a free person. This wasn't a cultural quirk or the eccentricity of individual rulers. It was state policy, refined across generations, encoded in law, and blessed by religious scholars who interpreted Islamic jurisprudence to grant the Sultan unlimited authority over his slaves. Because that's what every woman in the Imperial Harem was, regardless of the euphemisms later historians would apply. Not wives, not consorts, slaves, captured in raids across the Caucasus, purchased in markets from Crimea to Cairo, gifted by governors seeking favor, or sold by impoverished families who believed palace service offered their daughters better futures than subsistence farming. The selection process itself reveals the calculated nature of this system. Slave traders who specialized in supplying the palace developed expertise in identifying girls who possessed not just physical beauty, but psychological traits that predicted successful assimilation into harem life. They wanted intelligence, but not too much; adaptability, but not independence; youth that could be molded before identity fully formed. Girls between 8 and 15 were considered ideal, young enough to forget their previous lives, old enough to begin immediate training in the elaborate protocols that governed every waking moment within the palace. When a girl entered the palace, the first act was the erasure of her name. This was not poetic renaming. It was the deliberate dismantling of identity. A Circassian girl called Aishi might be renamed Gulbahar, Rose of Spring. A Georgian named Nino could become Hurrem, the cheerful one. These new Turkish names functioned as brands, severing every thread that tied them to family, language, and memory. Her original name was never to be spoken again. Any mention of her childhood could be punished, as though her past had been legally erased. What followed was a training system as meticulously structured as a military academy. New arrivals were placed at the lowest rung, supervised by women who had survived through perfected obedience. They learned to walk without sound, speak only when summoned, read emotional cues with silent precision, anticipate wishes before they became orders. Any spark of individuality was methodically broken, not with visible wounds, but with irreversible quietness of the soul. The language lessons were particularly insidious. Women had to learn Ottoman Turkish, the courtly dialect that blended Turkish, Persian, and Arabic into a linguistic marker of elite status. But they were forbidden from speaking in ways that suggested education or intellect. They mastered a vocabulary of submission that reduced the full spectrum of human emotion to variations on devotion, gratitude, and sexual availability. Eunuchs monitored conversations constantly, reporting any discussion that strayed beyond approved topics. Weather, clothing, palace gossip, and endless praise for the Sultan's wisdom and virility. Physical transformation accompanied this psychological dismantling. Women's bodies were modified to match imperial preferences through controlled diets, specific exercises, cosmetic procedures, and clothing designed to emphasize or conceal particular features. They learned to move like dancers even when walking to fetch water, to position themselves for maximum visual appeal even when alone, to suppress natural reactions of pain, fatigue, or discomfort that might disturb their master's pleasure. Their own physical sensations became secondary to creating the illusion of perfect, constant availability. The system's true cruelty was not only in how it treated each woman, but in how it forced them to betray one another. Power became a battlefield where another woman's rise could mean your downfall or your death. At the top presided the Valide Sultan, mother to the reigning Sultan, commanding immense influence, yet relying entirely on her son's survival. Beneath her were wives, favorites, and concubines, ranked by sons born, knights shared, and their skill in surviving the palace's ruthless political tides. This competition wasn't about luxury or status, it was about survival. Women understood that falling from favor didn't mean moving to smaller quarters. It meant potential execution, exile to distant provinces, or being given to lower-ranking officials as gifts. The Sultan's attention became literally a matter of life and death, creating an environment where mothers competed against daughters, sisters betrayed each other, and alliances shifted like desert sand. The system weaponized every human instinct for connection, transforming natural bonds into tools of mutual destruction. The scheduling system reveals the complete dehumanization at the heart of this intimacy. The Kuzlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch who controlled harem administration, maintained detailed logs of which woman spent each night with the Sultan. These weren't romantic encounters or expressions of affection. They were state functions, documented in official records to establish paternity of potential heirs and ensure proper succession protocols. Women's most intimate moments became administrative data, their bodies reduced to entries in bureaucratic ledgers, their sexual encounters tracked with the same precision applied to grain inventories or tax revenues. Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent's reign, celebrated in Western histories for legal reforms and military victories, provides documented examples of how this terror functioned in practice. Court chronicles describe the execution of Gulbahar Hatun, one of his early favorites, for the crime of trading her scheduled night with the Sultan to another woman. This wasn't treated as adultery or marital betrayal. It was theft of state property, punishable by strangulation. The woman who accepted the trade died beside her. Both were buried in unmarked graves, their names struck from palace records as though they had never existed. But these individual executions pale beside the systematic violence that accompanied succession crises. Ottoman law, formalized in the 15th century, stated clearly, "Whichever of my sons inherits the Sultanate, it is proper for him to kill his brothers to preserve the order of the world." This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal policy. When a sultan died, his successor's first act was fratricide on an industrial scale, and when the princes died, the women attached to them faced destruction. Sultan Mehmed III's succession in 1595 provides the most documented example. Upon his father's death, Mehmed ordered the execution of 19 brothers, some still infants, strangled by deaf-mute executioners to prevent their final words from becoming curses. But the killing didn't stop with his brothers. Every woman who had served those princes, who had borne their children, who had invested years building relationships with men who might have become sultan, faced immediate liquidation of their futures. Some were executed outright. Others were married to minor provincial officials, their status plummeting from imperial household to the property of bureaucrats who treated them as trophies of the new regime's consolidation of power. The women who survived these purges carried knowledge that shaped every subsequent action. Nothing was permanent. Favor could evaporate between heartbeats. The prince you'd attached your survival to could be strangled while you slept. The son you'd borne could become either your salvation or your death sentence, depending on accidents of birth order and political timing. This created a psychological state that modern trauma specialists recognize as complex PTSD operating at institutional scale. Constant hypervigilance, inability to form secure attachments, emotional numbing as a survival mechanism, dissociation from one's own body and experiences. Sultan Ibrahim's reign, from 1640 to 1648, demonstrates what happened when psychological instability in a ruler combined with absolute power over women's lives. Ibrahim had spent years imprisoned in the cafes, the cage where potential heirs were confined to prevent them from plotting rebellion. He watched as his brothers were systematically murdered. He lived every day expecting execution. When he finally became sultan, the trauma had created a monster whose cruelty operated without logic or restraint. The chroniclers describe scenes that read like horror fiction, but come from official Ottoman sources. Ibrahim lining up virgin girls in palace gardens, forcing them to participate in mass sexual assaults framed as theatrical performances. Mirror-lined chambers where women watched their own humiliation reflected infinitely around them while he assigned them animal roles, calling them mares while he played the stallion. Human sexuality reduced to bestial spectacle designed to satisfy fantasies that grew more bizarre as his grip on sanity deteriorated. The most infamous incident occurred in 1648, documented in multiple contemporary sources. Ibrahim, convinced that his current harem had been corrupted by a conspiracy he couldn't articulate, ordered the execution of all 280 women simultaneously. They were bound, placed in weighted sacks, and thrown from boats into the Bosporus. The waters churned with drowning women for hours. Local residents along the shores reported hearing screams carried on the wind. Some sacks didn't sink properly. bodies washed up on beaches for days afterward. Palace officials documented the executions with bureaucratic precision, noting the cost of the sacks, the wages paid to the executioners, and the amount of lime used to treat the beaches where corpses had contaminated the shore. What drives a human being to order such an act? What internal calculus makes mass murder seem like a reasonable solution to paranoia? The answer lies in the absolute nature of Ottoman imperial power, combined with a legal framework that classified women in the harem as property rather than persons. They weren't being murdered in Ibrahim's mind. They were being disposed of, like furniture that no longer pleased or clothing that had gone out of fashion. The empire's religious scholars, when consulted, found nothing in Islamic law that prohibited a master from killing his slaves, provided he didn't violate specific rules about torture or mutilation. But focusing only on the spectacular atrocities obscures the daily, grinding terror that formed the texture of harem life. The constant awareness that your master could summon you for sex, conversation, or execution with equal casualness. The knowledge that showing too much personality could be interpreted as arrogance, but showing too little could suggest disloyalty. The impossible psychological tightrope of appearing perfectly devoted to a man who owned hundreds of women and forgot most of their names. Women developed elaborate survival strategies that passed from generation to generation. Secret communication systems using the language of flowers, where a specific bloom sent to another chamber conveyed warnings or information. Networks of mutual protection, where women formed covert alliances despite the system's efforts to keep them isolated and competitive. Methods of emotional dissociation that allowed them to separate their consciousness from their bodies during trauma, preserving some core of self in a place the Sultan's power couldn't reach. The most tragic survival strategy involved the maternal bond. Women who bore sons understood their children represented both salvation and potential destruction. A son who became Sultan elevated his mother to supreme power as Valide Sultan. But most princes never reached the throne. They ended up strangled in succession purges, taking their mother's hopes with them. The system forced women to invest everything in children, while knowing the odds overwhelmingly favored those children's violent deaths. Ottoman records document mothers who went insane after their sons' executions. Women who had suppressed every other emotion for decades, finally breaking under this ultimate violation. The foreign diplomats who witnessed these practices struggled to communicate what they'd seen to European courts. Venetian ambassadors wrote coded dispatches describing atrocities they couldn't explicitly name. French envoys developed euphemisms for mass executions that barely concealed their horror. Habsburg representatives sent reports that their own monarchs dismissed as propaganda because the systematic nature of the cruelty seemed beyond belief. How could an empire that produced sublime architecture, sophisticated legal codes, and cultural achievements also operate what amounted to a state-sponsored system of sexual slavery and arbitrary murder? The answer is that these weren't contradictions. They were complementary aspects of the same power structure. The sultans who commissioned the Suleymaniye Mosque and codified Ottoman law were the same men who maintained detailed inventories of enslaved women and ordered executions with bureaucratic efficiency. Imperial power expressed itself through beauty and terror simultaneously. The marble corridors where women were strangled were decorated with the finest Iznik tiles. The gardens where mass sexual assaults occurred featured landscaping that inspired poets across 3 continents. Archaeological excavations near former palace sites continue revealing the physical evidence that written records documented. Mass graves containing the remains of young women, their bones showing signs of violent death. Skeletal analyses indicating prolonged malnutrition despite the harem's reputation for luxury, suggesting food was used as a control mechanism. DNA studies revealing that many women came from regions hundreds of miles away, confirming the systematic trafficking networks that fed the palace's insatiable appetite for fresh captives. The women who survived into old age, who outlived the sultans who had owned them, carried invisible scars that shaped their remaining years. Ottoman sources describe former harem women who spent decades in freedom, never learning to make decisions for themselves. So thoroughly had their agency been destroyed. Women who startled at male voices decades after leaving the palace. Women who could never form healthy relationships because intimacy had been weaponized into a survival mechanism rather than an expression of connection. The system's legacy extended far beyond its immediate victims. Families across the empire's territories developed elaborate strategies to hide daughters from palace officials who toured provinces, selecting girls for the harem. Some deliberately scarred their daughters' faces. Others married them off at extremely young ages to prevent their being classified as available. The mere possibility of selection created terror that rippled through communities across 3 continents, shaping attitudes toward female beauty, marriage, and autonomy that persisted long after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. When the empire collapsed in 1922 and the last sultan fled into exile, the harem system ended, but the psychological patterns it created did not disappear. For centuries, women inside those walls survived through fear, silence, and emotional detachment, and those survival strategies seeped into family lineages. Researchers today still trace intergenerational trauma in descendants of those once tied to the harem, where coping mechanisms became inherited ways of being. The archives preserve the evidence, receipts listing the sale of women as commodities, execution orders stamped with imperial authority, inventories ranking women by appearance and age, and desperate letters from mothers whose daughters never returned. This history isn't about blame, it is about understanding how power, when left unchecked, reshapes intimacy into control. The woman who entered believing she was chosen for honor discovered what countless others had learned. A gilded cage is still a cage, and beauty under domination becomes its own undoing. Tonight, the Bosporus still flows past the walls of Topkapi Palace, its waters dark and cold. If you stand on those shores at the right time, when the wind comes from a certain direction, locals say you can still hear something like crying carried on the waves. The rational mind dismisses it as wind through marble, water against stone, the acoustic tricks old buildings play. But the people who live there know the truth in their bones. Some sounds, once made, never fully disappear. Some terror imprints itself on a place so thoroughly that centuries cannot wash it clean. The palace gardens are museums now, the harem quarters tourist attractions. But the women whose screams once filled those spaces left traces that no amount of restoration can completely erase. They lived in fear. They died in fear. And they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to sultans' reigns, but as human beings whose suffering we finally, belatedly, acknowledge for what it was. One of history's most systematic betrayals of the promise that power should protect, not destroy, those under its dominion.